Today we'll be starting a new unit and we'll be covering ecosystems for about the next 3 weeks. So in this unit we'll be talking about what an ecosystem is, what are the different components of it, what makes a healthy ecosystem, and what happens when ecosystems start changing, and how do humans influence ecosystems, and what benefit can we have from having a healthy ecosystem. All right, so what we're really looking at here is the study of ecology. And ecology is the study of the interactions of living organisms, right? There might be plants or animals, with each other and with the non-living components of their environment. So how does the environment, the land, water, air in an area, how does that influence the animals that live there, and how do those animals interact with each other and with plants? So we break down an ecosystem into two different parts. We say that there's abiotic factors and biotic factors. So abiotic factors, these are non-living things. So for example, the temperature of an area, or the amount of sunlight, or the amount of rainfall, or the amount of wind, or the type of landscape. Is it a high elevation mountain? Is it a flat grassland? Is it an ocean? Right? So just all of the non-living things that are describing that ecosystem. And then biotic are all of the living things. So this would include all of the plants and all of the animals. We'll do some examples here in a minute, but just abiotic are all of the non-living things in an ecosystem. Biotic, what are the living things? All right, so why study ecology? Well, we want to find out, we want to understand what the connections are between the living and non-living things in an environment, and also what happens when things change. The Earth is going through a huge change right now because of climate change. There's been climate change in the past, but never at the rate that it's happening today. It's happening much faster than it ever has in the past. So it's very important that we understand how that will change things and how that will change both the plant and the animal life that we rely on. All right, so I'll give you a second here. See if you can think of what are the different factors on Earth, what are the different parts of Earth that allow humans to survive? I'll give you a minute to think about that. Well, let's see, what do we need to survive? I mean, we need air. So we call that part of the Earth the atmosphere. So the atmosphere is a layer of air that's surrounding Earth. It's mostly nitrogen, but it also contains oxygen, carbon dioxide, and a number of other gases in smaller amounts. Humans, plants, they both rely on that, right? We need oxygen. Plants need carbon dioxide. Water, right? We also need water for humans to survive on Earth. So we call that the hydrosphere. So the hydrosphere includes all water on the Earth, whether it's an ocean, a lake, a river. We need some sort of land as well. So we call that the lithosphere. Right? And the lithosphere could be different types of land. It could be a fertile plain. It could be a large rocky mountain. And the last part is the sun. The sun is what allows all of the energy, it's what gives Earth the energy in order for life to survive. If we didn't have the sun, the Earth would be very cold and nothing would be living. Right? We need the sun in order for plants to grow, in order for the temperature to be survivable. Plants take in the energy from the sun using photosynthesis in order to grow. So the sun is what brings in the energy to the Earth in order for life to survive. So these are really all of the main parts of the Earth, the different parts. And there's actually a picture that we normally look at here. So it just looks like this. So we say these are the different parts of the Earth. The atmosphere is the air, right? If you go far enough away from the Earth, not that far away, you're eventually in space, and the space is a vacuum. There is no air there at all. There's no atmosphere. We have the hydrosphere. We have the lithosphere, the Earth. And all of these things combined are called the biosphere, which is just the living area, the place on Earth where some sort of plant or animal can live. All right, so let's specifically look at ecosystems. So an ecosystem is a system of all of the interacting abiotic, right, non-living, and biotic, living parts of a certain place. So it's just all of the different parts. So if you look at a specific place on Earth, what are all the different parts of living and non-living things that are interacting together? That's an ecosystem. So let's look at an example. So for example, here is a grassland ecosystem. So you might find this somewhere in the prairies, right? So maybe Manitoba, Saskatchewan, parts of Alberta. So maybe just pause the video here and try and think of what are all of the non-living, the abiotic parts here that describe this ecosystem, and what are the biotic ones that describe, so the living parts of this ecosystem. So pause the video right now and see if you can think of a couple ideas. All right, hopefully you had a chance to fill in some ideas there. So let's start with the abiotic parts of this system. All right, so what are the non-living things here? Well, first of all, I'll try and kind of describe the land. So I just described it as, well, it's flat, rolling hills. Okay, I mean, that's a non-living part. That's just describing the area. Because of that, there's probably high wind. If there's no trees around, the wind can build up and you get very high winds. So that's a good way of describing this area. A high sunlight, right? There's no tree cover that's going to block the sun, so the sun is really hitting the ground. So high sunlight. Probably moderate rainfall. It doesn't look particularly wet. There's kind of limited rivers or lakes. But there seems to be some things growing, so there's probably at least moderate rainfall. And, once again, there are quite a few things growing, right? There's grass cover everywhere. So the soil is probably fairly nutrient rich. It seems like things can grow here. All right, so you'll notice none of these things are living. These are all just non-living things that are describing this ecosystem. Okay, let's look at the living things now, biotic factors. All right, well, first of all, let's look at the plants. In this case, there's a bunch of grass. Because of the high wind, it's probably pretty deeply rooted grass, right? It's held very, very strong into the ground. Right, so there's lots of kind of little shrubbery and then lots of this grass everywhere. And it's really covering absolutely everything. All right, plants are living, so they're included in biotic. Let's think of some animals now. Well, there's obviously these grazing animals, right? Deer, maybe bison, depending on where we look. Right, they seem to move around quite a bit, right? They're grazing. Probably a lot of insects as well. Right? If you think of all the small bugs and insects that you'd run into in a grassland like this. Right? Those insects thrive in this environment with these high grasses. And because of that, things like mice and other rodents also survive in that sort of environment. And, also like a prairie dog. Right? If you think about the prairies, and in this case, why do those animals thrive here? Well, they can live underground. They can eat the grasses that are there. They just fit well with this sort of environment. They've adapted in order to fit that environment. And I might actually include one more here. Because of these rodents and whatnot, you'd probably also have things like a fox. So here we're just trying to think of all of the living and non-living things that are in this ecosystem. And these things are all kind of connected together, right? These animals have adapted to live well in this sort of environment. That's why they've survived and thrived here. So the abiotic and the biotic things are connected together. And the different biotic things are connected together, right? These animals are relying on these sort of plants that grow here. So this is just one example of an ecosystem, right? But you can think of many other ones, right? You could look at a rainforest, a tropical rainforest, and you could try and describe the abiotic and biotic things there. Or you could look at a desert. Or you could look at the Arctic. Or you could look at just a lake, right? So you'd say it's an aquatic ecosystem, a lake. Well, inside of a lake, you have abiotic factors, right? The water, the type of water, the amount of the temperature. And then you also have biotic things, right? The plant, the algae, and the plants that are growing in the lake, the types of fish. All right, so we can actually put a lot of these terms together into kind of a single diagram here. So we'll fill in this diagram, and then hopefully it'll kind of match up a bunch of these terms that we're talking about. All right, so at the very top we say the environment. Right? This is talking about all of the places on Earth that things can live. All right, we said that there are two main factors, or two main categories, abiotic. Abiotic was the non-living things in the environment. And what these things are doing is they're describing the habitat, right? So we said rolling hills, high wind, high sunlight when we were describing the grassland. This is describing the habitat, the places that these animals are living in. Right? So we talked about the amount of sunlight, maybe amount of rainfall, the type of land or water. Right? So the abiotic factors are really just describing that area, describing the habitat that the living things will be in. And then the other category we talked about was biotic. Right? So biotic was the living things. Now we can actually break these living things down into a couple different categories as well. So we could talk about an individual. So for example, I will use an example of a lake. So for example, if I'm looking at a lake, I might have an individual living thing being one fish, this particular fish, right? We'll call him Bob. Now, if I look at all of those types of fish, all of the fish that are exactly the same type of fish, we call that a population. So we might say, oh, these are all of the whatever type of fish. Now, if we looked at all of the different types of animals, so for example, all of the orange fish and all of the gray fish and all of the plants and the crabs in this case, we'd say that's a community of living things. And then if we put everything together, if we put the habitat, the abiotic area, the abiotic factors, and the living things together, so in this case now they're including the water and the land that this lake is in, we would call this an ecosystem. So the ecosystem is including all of these things. So I like this diagram over here as kind of a way of describing it. Right? Your biotic factors are just an individual creature, a population of all of the same type of creature, a community, all of the living things together, and then an ecosystem, including the abiotic, the non-living factors. So I know I went through that pretty quickly. Maybe just pause the video and make sure you've filled in all of the blanks there. All right, last thing that we're going to talk about is biodiversity. This is a pretty important one. So what is biodiversity? Biodiversity is the number of different species in an ecosystem. Okay, so if you think about the lake that we were just talking about, right? There was a number of different species there. There's different types of plants, right? Different algae, different types of plants growing from the bottom of the lake. There's also different types of fish. There was the orange fish and the gray fish. There was the crab and then some sort of jellyfish thing. So in this case, there's a bunch of different species that are living there. And the more biodiversity that you have, the more variety of animals and plants that you have, the more stable and the more sustainable your ecosystem is. So biodiversity is a positive thing. You want more biodiversity. Now, why is that? So let's think about this for a minute. If you have more types of plants and animals, it means that if there's a change, at least some of those living things will adapt better to that change than others. So this is because there is a higher chance that some of the species will adapt to changes in the ecosystem. Let's look at an example. All right, so I have two pictures here. Here I have a rubber tree farm, and over here I have a rainforest. All right, so let's look at the rubber tree farm. So thinking about living things here, how many different types of species do we have here? Not very many, right? So it looks like all of these trees are exactly the same. So in this case, there's one type of tree. There's a little bit of grass growing there. In terms of living things, maybe there's a few rodents or insects, but it doesn't seem like there's much. So in this case, we have very limited types of species here. One type of tree, one type of grass, maybe a couple of different small animals. So we say this is a low biodiversity. So the question is, what if there's a change to this environment? What if there was some sort of sickness that that rubber trees were susceptible to? Well, in that case, every single rubber tree would die here. Or what if there was a drought? In this case, if the rubber trees can't survive a drought, all of them would die at the same time. And now suddenly, you would be left with an environment that has almost no living things in it. All right, let's look over at the rainforest here. In the rainforest, let's think of all the different types of species we could have here. Well, just right off the bat, I noticed that even with the large trees, this tree looks quite a bit different than that one. So these are two different types of trees. There's even a smaller one there that might be another kind. So maybe three different types of trees. There's a bunch of different types of shrubs here. There's a bunch of ferns. It looks like there's some moss that's growing on the tree. There's also some moss that's down here on these rocks. There's some vines, some sort of flower. So right off the bat, I'm at a whole bunch of different plants. Maybe 3, 4 species of trees, number of different species of foliage here. We can also think about living things, right? We have water here, so that's automatically going to bring, possibly some creatures that survive in water. Right? We're going to have a number of different creatures, whether they're insects, bugs, rodents, maybe larger animals that can that can eat the rodents. So we probably have a whole bunch of different types of animals that are living here. If we think about birds, right, there's a bunch of different spots that birds can live, so maybe different types of birds. Right? Over in the rubber tree, I mean, I'm not sure how many types of birds could live there. So right off the bat, there are a bunch of different types of plants and animals that are living here, far more than the rubber tree farm. We say this is a high biodiversity, right? Just by looking at this picture, we can count, 10, 12 different types of plants and probably just as many types of animals. And that's just by quickly looking at it. So in this case, if there was a change, right, let's say that there was a drought here. Okay, if there was a drought, maybe some of the trees die. Maybe some of the smaller trees can't survive. But some of the bigger ones probably do still. So in this case, maybe some of the trees die, but other ones survive. Or maybe there's some sort of infection that one of these types of trees is susceptible to. Well, some of the trees would die, right? Maybe these types of trees would die, but the other ones would be fine. So in this case, the other ones would quickly, take their place. So in this case, if there is a change to that ecosystem, maybe it will kill some of the species, but other ones will take their place and other ones will be able to survive or maybe even thrive in that new environment. So in this case, if you have high biodiversity, if there is a big change to your environment, at least some of the species will be okay and they'll continue to live. But if you have a low biodiversity, if that change affects that species, it might just wipe out that entire area and suddenly you're left with a desert. High biodiversity is also important for humans because when it comes to finding different resources that we can use, when it comes to growing different types of foods, finding different animals in order for food. Also, if we're looking at making different medicines, if we have a wide variety of plants and animals to look at and to choose from, it's more likely that we'll find one that will be more beneficial to us. But if we have limited number of plants and animals to choose from, there's not much we can do with it. Right? So that high biodiversity, it's beneficial for humans because it gives us a more varied plants and animals to choose from in order to find a solution for something.